In this exercise, we will explore some of the core Node modules. In particular, we'll look at the HTTP module that is built into Node and use the HTTP module to configure and start up a simple web server. We will also look at how we can serve up static files from our Node HTTP server. We'll also look at the file system module and the path module and how they can help us to serve static files in our Node-based HTTP server. So let's explore some of the core Node modules in this exercise. To get started with this exercise, go to a convenient location on your computer. So we will go to the Node.js folder that we had already created in one of the previous exercises. And in the Node.js folder, I'm going to create a new folder named Node HTTP. And then we will set this up as a Node application. Also, moving into the Node HTTP folder, let's create a subfolder there named public, which will contain some of the HTML files that we will serve up from our Node HTTP application. Now, moving to a terminal, navigate to the Node HTTP folder and let's initialize this folder to be a Node application. So we will start with npm init and initialize the package.json file here. And then we'll give the package name as Node HTTP and accept the standard version. And the description is Node HTTP module example. And the starting point is index.js, node test command, node git repository for the moment, and author, type in your name, and accept the rest as is. And that should create the package.json manifest file. Now let's open this project in our favorite editor. So let me start up my Visual Studio Code at this folder. And in the Visual Studio Code, let's go to the package.json file, and then we will add in another script to the package.json file called start, and which would execute node index. And remember to put the comma after the test here. And save the changes to the package.json file. Now, in the project, create a new file named index.js. Now, we're going to configure this index.js to use the Node HTTP module. So, in this file, let's type in const HTTP require HTTP. So you can see that we are using the HTTP core module and we are requiring it by simply specifying the HTTP core module's name there. In addition, let's declare a couple of constants here, and then we'll call host name and the port number as 3000 by default. Now, let's set up the server. To set up the server, we'll say const server and equal to HTTP. The HTTP module supports a method called create server. So we're going to use the create server method on that. This create server method will take a function as a parameter, and this function takes two values as parameters, request and response. And as you can see, I am writing an arrow function here. So the request and response are the two parameters to the function that we supply as a parameter to the create server method here. And inside this, we will say console log request headers. So here the rec and res are the incoming HTTP request to the server and the corresponding response object that is going to be constructed by the server and returned to the client that connects to this HTTP server that we are creating here. So the request is the incoming request from any browser or from anywhere that is trying to access this server that we're going to start up using this HTTP node application that we are developing here. So from the request object gives us access to the headers in the incoming HTTP request. So I'm going to log the incoming headers of the HTTP request coming in using this console log, just for my information, just to know where this request is coming from. Thereafter, we can construct the response by using the res, and this will provide us with a method called status code. The status code will enable us to set up the status code for the response message. So in this case, I will set up the status code as 200. If you recall from the earlier discussion on networking essentials, you know that a status code of 200 means that everything is okay. And so we set up the status code here for the response message, and then we will also set up the header for the response message. And one of the header fields that we're going to set up is called content type. And the content type, we will specify this to be text HTML. So the response body will contain the data in the form of HTML here. So the header is set up to inform the client that you are sending in the response, and the body is of formatted in HTML format. And then finally, we will say res end. So this ends the response here. And when this is done, this information will be sent back to the client. So in here, let me just construct an inline HTML page here. So I'll say HTML body h1, and we'll say hello world, and close off the h1 tag, the body tag, and the HTML tag right there. And that is a valid HTML response that can be sent back from our server here. So this server, as you expect, is simply going to send a hello world to the client. So now that we have set up the server, we need to start this server. To start the server in Node, we need to say server and listen. And this will start up the listening port on which the server will listen for incoming requests. And this would be started at the port number given by port, which we have set up already here in the const port. And then the second parameter is the host name, which we have already set up earlier. And the third parameter is a function that will be executed when the server starts up. And in this function, we're just going to print out the information about this server. So in here, I'm just going to say console log, and in the console log, I'm going to print out the information. So I will use a back quote. So note the use of back quote, not the normal quote. The reason why we are using that is because we're going to be using some variables inside the string that we are going to construct here. So we'll say server running at http:// and then we will say $, and then host name. Recall that this host name we have already declared earlier. And then the second part will say : dollar and port. So these two values will be substituted by the corresponding values. And since we are enclosing this in back quotes, and if you enclose something inside dollar braces, that will be replaced by its value in this string here. That's it. We have a simple HTTP server up and running. So let's save the changes to this, and we'll go and start up our application and see what it serves up. Going to the terminal, let's type npm start, and this should start up our application, and we notice that it prints out saying server running at http://localhost:3000. Now you can access this URL by typing it into the address bar of any browser. So let me start up a Chrome browser window and then type this and see what the server will return. Starting a new window, let me just type in http localhost:3000, and that should return a hello world as we expect. Now when we go to the console, you see that on the console the details of the incoming requests header is printed out here. Some things are very easy to locate here. So this says host localhost 3000, and you also see that the user agent is set to Chrome here, the Chrome version that I am using here. So that is an interesting illustration of the HTTP request message and what is contained in the header of the request message that came in here. So interesting to observe what your server is printing out onto the screen here. With this, we complete the first half of this exercise. Now we can initialize this application into a Git repository and then save the changes to the Git repository. So let's go ahead and do that next. At the prompt, type git init and then initialize the repository, and then we'll say git status, and you see that these two files are new. So we'll say git add dot and do git commit -m node http example1, and then check this into our Git repository. Now, yet another tool that is very useful when we are looking at server-side applications is called Postman. Now, Postman comes in the form of either a Chrome browser extension or a standalone tool that you can download and install on your computer. So to do that, in our browser, let's type http getpostman.com, and then this is where you can obtain the Postman tool for your specific OS and then install it. The Postman tool allows you to create HTTP requests and then send them in. It also gives you the flexibility of setting up the headers for your HTTP request before you send it in. And then when the response comes back, you're able to examine the response, including the headers of the response that comes back from the server side. So I find Postman tool to be very useful. There are a few other tools like these, but Postman seems to be the best in the market at the moment. So I'm going to make use of Postman through the rest of this course. If you don't want to install it, you can also install the Chrome browser extension of Postman and then use it. I'm going to download the Mac OS version of Postman and then install it on my machine and then make use of it. Once you have the Postman, either the standalone version or the Chrome browser extension installed, you can start it up, and you would see that the user interface is more or less the same for both the standalone version and also the Chrome browser extension. And once you have the Postman up and running, then type in the request URL box localhost:3000 and send a request to your server. Make sure that your Node HTTP server is up and running. So when you send the request, you will immediately get a response from the server with the HTML code here. Now, the advantage, as you see with using Postman, is that you can see the actual body of the message. You can also look at the headers to see what has been sent back from the server. You can also set up a lot of details in Postman when you're sending requests from the server. Now, many of these may not be very easy to do using a standard browser window. So that's the reason why I prefer to use Postman for generating the HTTP requests to my server and then observing the response that comes back from the server side. Also notice that it shows the status code here and some other information about the request and the response time from the server side. Now that we have created a simple Node-based HTTP server, let's extend it further. Let's create a couple of HTML files in the public folder. We'll call this as index.html, and then also about us.html, and then just include some bare bones information in here. So we'll say HTML and title as this is index.html, and then we'll type in body of the HTML page, say h1 index.html in the body, and then this is the contents of this file. Some basic HTML code here. Let me copy this and then paste this also into the about us.html page. And contents of the about us.html file. That's it. We just created two HTML pages. And these are static HTML pages that we have created in the public folder. Now, can we set up our Node HTTP server to be able to serve up static pages? So this is what we're going to configure in the second part of this exercise. So going back to index.js file, in addition to the HTTP core module, I'm going to also import the file system core module and the path core module. The path allows you to specify the path of a file in your local file system. The file system module allows you to read and write files from your local file system. So with this, we will say constant server HTTP create server. For the console log, instead of typing in the entire request headers, I will simply type in just sufficient information. So I'll say request for just the URL of the request by method so the method would be either get, put, post, or delete methods. So this will log this information. Now, what we're going to do is instead of sending this response, the standard hello world response, here we're going to examine the method, and then we'll say if rec method is equal to get. So we will only service get requests in this example. Otherwise, we will say that there is an error. So if there is a get request that comes in, then we'll examine the URL that comes in. So we'll say if rec URL is / we'll say file URL equal to HTML. So if you do not give a specific file name, but you just send a request to localhost 3000, it will default to the index.html. Otherwise, we'll say file URL is equal to rec URL. So this way we have constructed which file to serve up. Now we'll say we'll find the path of the file. We'll say path resolve. So the path module supports this resolve method. So this will translate this into the full-fledged path for this file, the file that we have just constructed, the file URL that we have just constructed. So this will give us the full path for that file, and then we will say constant file extension. So we want to make sure that the file name extension is HTML. So from the file path, we will examine the file name extension, and then we'll say if file ext equal to, so if it is an HTML file, then we know how to serve it from this particular version of the Node HTTP server. So we'll say if file extension is HTML, then we know that the file is an HTML file, and we have the two files, index and aboutus.html. So we will check to see if this file exists. So we'll say if file exists, file path. So the exists method will check to see if the file exists. So we'll say fs.exists file path, and this one will take as a second parameter a callback function. So notice the use of the first callback function in our example. So this callback function will be called with this parameter exists in there. So inside this callback parameter, this exists will be either true or false. So this is the return parameter for this callback function. So in here, we will check and we'll say if not exists, so which means that the file doesn't exist, then we will say res status code is 404. Recall that if the file doesn't exist, you will send a status code of 404 saying you cannot find the file, and then we'll say res set header, and we'll set the header to content type text HTML, and then we need to send the HTML file here or the HTML code. So I will do the basic HTML code, HTML body h1 error 404. We'll say plus file URL plus not found, and close off the HTML page. So in here, as you notice, you're using the exists function of the file system module to check if the file exists. So you give the file path as the first parameter, and the second one is the callback function. Inside this callback function, if it says the exists is false, then you're going to send back a standard 404 error message saying that you cannot find the file. And after we do this, we'll simply return. Otherwise, we'll say res status code 200 res set header content type text HTML. Now, we need to read in the file and then send the file out. So this is where, from the file system module, we will use the create read stream, which will take the file path as a parameter. So this create read stream method will read in the file from this file path and then convert that into a stream of bytes, and then we will pipe this through to the response. So that will be included into the response in the body of the response. So that way we have just taken the file and then constructed it into the response here. And that's it. The file is ready to be sent out. Okay, so this is if the file extension is HTML, you're checking to make sure that you handle this correctly. So this is where you will read in the file and then send it out. If the file extension is not HTML, then of course we need to send an error message. So right there, we will say, we will copy this particular code from here and then paste it in there. We'll say else status code is 404 content text HTML, and the error message says error 404 file URL it's not found, but it is not an HTML file. So that is the error that we're going to send back in this case. And finally, for the last else case, so here we are saying the method. So this else corresponds to the request method. So if the request method is not get but some other request method, then we won't handle that in this version of our Node application. So we'll send back status code 404 content HTML, and then we will say error 404, and we'll say rec method not supported by this Node HTML server here. That's it. With these changes, we are now ready to restart our browser and then let it serve up the HTML files here. So let's save the changes and then go and restart our server and then examine what it sends when we send various requests to the server. Going to the terminal, if your server is running, stop it by typing Control-C and then restart the server. And when the server is up and running, let's send some requests to it. First from a browser and thereafter from Postman. Going to your browser window, let's type localhost :3000 and see that this returns the index.html file as we expect. And then we'll say localhost :3000 index.html, and this will also return the index.html file. Now, if we send about us.html, it says about us.html and it returns it correctly. Let's now send a request for about us.txt and see what it returns. So it says about us.txt is not an HTML file. Then let's send a request to test.html, and we know that test.html doesn't exist, so it says test.html not found. So we see that by using the browser, we are able to fetch those files that exist, and the server is able to send up the files to the browser. Let's now go to Postman and try to generate the same request and see the response from the server. Next, going to Postman, let's send a GET request to localhost 3000, and you see that this returns the index.html file. Let's send a request to about us.html, and then you see that it returns the about us.html file. And then we'll send a request to the text file, and then it says error 404, not an HTML file, and you see that the status here says 404 not found. And then we'll instead of sending a GET request, see, this is the advantage of using Postman, I'll send a PUT request, and you notice that this says error PUT not supported, and so with the status 404 here, and so on. So this is how you can configure a Node HTTP server to be able to serve up files, HTTP files in this particular case. Now you can easily imagine extending this HTTP server to handle many different kinds of files and so on. But of course, correspondingly, the code will also get more complicated than what we have at this moment. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have seen how we can set up a simple Node-based HTTP server that serves up files from our server side.